Welcome. This particular talk is especially important because this is the last month of this academic year, and hopefully we will have the same event in the fall next year, and we will let you know when we plan for the China lecture series in the next academic year. And please pay attention to the email and everything. And I'm double happy because we have a very good scholar from Ohio State, from where my oldest daughter graduated, and two of my younger children are at the same school. If you ask them, MIT is never better than Ohio State. Ohio State is always a better school.
If you say so.
And more importantly, when I asked Max, and I told him that my oldest daughter is in a marching band, he can immediately appreciate the importance of being in the marching band. Among you guys, it's all in marching band. It's no big deal. No big deal. It's no big deal at MIT, right? Unless you get a sort of a Rhodes Scholar or whatever you. But in Ohio State, being in the marching band is really a tremendous honor.
Right.
Okay, so enough joke. Now, I'm very pleased to have Max to come over to talk about a topic that I personally am very interested. It's about a very interesting phenomenon that commonly called a ghost city in China. In fact, that term has increasingly become controversial in terms of how do you define ghost cities. And there's a lot of negative connotation associated with the term, and scholars are trying to increasingly not use the term, but call this kind of phenomenon oversupply of housing units in China, which could be a much more accurate and positive connotation of what's happening in that part of the world. So I'm very eager to hear from Max his insight about this particular housing phenomenon in China. In fact, I believe that it is your PhD thesis.
Part of it.
Part of it.
Yeah.
So apparently he has done a lot of work in doing the field work and investigation about the phenomenon in China. Let me give you a very brief a bio of Max. Max is an associate professor of geography at Ohio State Universities. He graduated from University of California, Berkeley, with a degree of PhD in geography. He is focusing his research on a particular region of China, Ordos, Inner Mongolia. And he is currently researching China, lower tier cities in the country. And he is now actually taking a time off in Japan. I should really thank him for flying from Japan directly and then leaving Boston to Japan directly tomorrow. So we are very grateful for your effort to coming to share your knowledge with us about Ghost City. So without any delay, I give the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Did you say you wanted the mic on or off? Or I think we probably don't need it on.
I can turn it off for you.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if this is in the way for anyone. Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you all, everyone, for coming out. I know it's the end of the semester, and it's a very busy time of year for everyone, for professors and students alike. And I know it's a cold middle of the day Wednesday, so that you've made it out here, I deeply appreciate it. I also appreciate very much this very kind invitation to come here. It's a real pleasure to be able to come and discuss some of the recent research that I've been doing. I want to also just take a moment very briefly to thank Heather Mooney for helping with the logistical stuff here, and also Saul Williams for helping with that as well, and others here at the center. Putting together these kinds of lecture series actually takes quite a bit of work, and it's not an easy thing to make it all kind of work as well as it has. This has been a seamless visit so far. So, and I've come from fairly far away just last night. So I also wanted to say that part of what's actually so great about being able to come here today is I get to see two people who I haven't seen in a very long time. One is a very dear friend of mine from childhood, Brad, who's here, sitting here. I haven't seen him in, I counted, 22 years. So that's very cool. And another, Sarah Williams, who teaches here in a GIS lab. Some of you probably know her. And then she's a high school friend of mine. And so we find ourselves converging in this one place here. So this is very fortunate, and what a great, rare opportunity for me. So I really appreciate it. But I also appreciate it because this talk has given me a really valuable opportunity to pull together some threads of recent research and some of my recent thinking about China's urbanization and the recent sort of urban frenzy in terms of urban build-out. Now, my personal pathway into this topic, the specific topic of ghost cities, is somewhat indirect in the sense that it comes out of a project, a larger project, under the title of Frontier Boomtown Urbanism, which looks at city building, sort of the political economy and cultures of city making and city building in north-central China, with a focus on Ordos municipality in Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. Now, it turns out that one of the major urban development projects in this particular worksite that I did my research in was the Kangbashi New District of Ordos municipality, which turns out, or later became, the ground zero for this ghost city phenomenon. And I ended up spending about 6 months in Ordos, living there, focusing my research mostly on coal, but also on urban processes. And I actually wrote a chapter of my dissertation on urban planning and urban design in this particular new district, Kangbashi. So the talk today is my attempt to expand on that particular bit of research and to draw other examples from around China into the discussion, and to give an interpretation of this phenomenon that's rooted in a sort of spatial geography, and hopefully this way can offer some insights into the broader phenomenon, and also to complicate this phenomenon conceptually as well. So before I begin, I just want to offer this. It's a quote, so I'll give you a second to read it. Has anyone seen this before? Anyone recognize this? It sounds like it's describing ghost towns in China. This is kind of phraseology that you find in the recent reports. But actually, this is Charles Dickens describing Washington, D.C. in 1842 in his American Notes for General Circulation after his visit to the United States. Now, I put this up here because I think it's sometimes useful to keep in mind and give some historical perspective when talking about ghost cities in China, just to remind ourselves that land speculation is not something that's unique to China historically. It's actually a phenomenon with a deep, deep lineage. And I also, in writing this talk, but also in my other research, I turn continually to the A.M. Sokolsky's great book from 1932 called The Great American Land Bubble, which was out of print for so long, but after the 2008 crisis was brought out of the archives and republished by the Cato Institute, of all places. And it's a great book which tells a story of how the United States, much like we're seeing in China these days, cities were built through continual and serial speculative investments in cities. And so just as a kind of, historical parallels are always a bit fraught, but it's sometimes good to have that in the back of our minds. Now, by way of entering the talk today, what I'd like to do first here is to give a few slides that show some images, and I'll narrate a few of some of the images. So as you can see, as they're labeled, on the left is this Kangbashi New District where I spent a fair amount of time in Inner Mongolia. And to the right here is what's called the Dongsheng District, which is the main city in Ordos municipality. So Ordos municipality is an enormous territory, roughly the size of Maine. And the main city in it is the city of Dongsheng, which is about 500,000 people. And Kambashi New District was the new urban project that the municipal government of Ordos initiated in 2004. Here we find the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City, also a major project in the city of Tianjin on the left. And downtown Tianjin, a major city, a sub-provincial level city in the administrative ranking system, just immediately east of Beijing. I'm sure many of you know of this city. Another example here, the Zhengdong New District on the left, a city immediately adjacent to the capital of Henan province, Zhengzhou. And you can see here, this is just a very typical downtown scene from Zhengzhou. And there you get an aerial shot of Zhengdong, which is the major urban development project initiated by the municipality of Zhengzhou. And finally, Chenggong New District outside of Kunming. Kunming is the capital of Yunnan province in southwest China, also a major city. Here's a downtown scene from the downtown area, and there's a scene from the urban development project on the outskirts of the city. Now, I want to just sort of step back and sort of reflect on what these landscapes and what these images might tell us. And I think you can see right away, and I was being cautious to be fair to these places in not being overly selective in the choice of images. These, I think, do fairly reflect the urbanism that we can encounter when we walk into these kinds of landscapes. And what you'll notice right away from these images just shown on these slides is that these new districts and the Eco-City project in the Tianjin case, they're characterized by a certain set of traits or characteristics. Specifically the newness. Obviously, they're called new district in many current cases, but also by their enormous size. Right? There's the huge boulevards, enormous landscapes, wide open spaces, very spaced out buildings and tall skyscrapers, but very spaced out. Skyscrapers in a park, to use Corbusier's term. And also emptiness in the case of the images on the left. Right? So there is an immediate impression, and I think it's actually quite real. Having walked through many of these kinds of places in the course of this research, there is an immediate impact, this very sensorial bodily experience of walking through these types of landscapes and feeling them as being very different than the hustle and bustle and, of the typical downtowns in Chinese cities that we're most familiar with. Right? So, so clearly something is going on in these kinds of sites on these sorts of places. And I've only shown 4, and I'll get to possibly how many of these types of places there are. There's many, many more. But something is going on. And then the question is, what is going on in these types of spaces? And so that is, in a broad sense, the basic question that I set out for this talk, which is, what are China's ghost cities? And actually, engaging that question seriously can open windows onto the processes driving what we geographers refer to as the social production of space in urban China today. Now, stepping back and analyzing this phenomenon is actually a chance to critically assess the trajectory and character of China's enormous urban transformations, particularly with respect to the key role being played by investments in the built environment and property and housing that drives the expansion of cities into places like we see up there on the top left. Now, the story that we have been hearing out of China since the 1980s is one that's all about huge flows of people leaving the countryside and entering into the cities. Possibly 250 million people is the floating population of ruralites working in cities. And this unrelenting process of urban industrial boom that has been happening since the 1980s. And I think against this backdrop, it's a very common and perhaps intuitive understanding or explanation for urban growth that involves a transition of vast populations from the countryside into cities over the recent decades. Right? And indeed, the urbanization rate has risen very fast. So the urbanization rate, meaning the percentage of the population that is formally registered as urban residents, has risen from 18% in 1978 to now 53%, possibly even more. Right? So this is a continual flow. 53% was 2014. Now, here we also see that urban physical spaces, the built-up areas, have also expanded dramatically. So from 1980 to 2010, we see an expansion roughly 4.5-fold, so 450% or more. But what's actually really interesting here is I think this second set of statistics that shows, or second set of figures that shows that actually it's in the past, or between 2000 and 2010, that you see this enormous push, an expansion of the built spaces in Chinese cities. And China currently accounts for 2/3 of East Asia's urban physical expansion in the 2000s, according to the World Bank. And of course, as we all know, East Asia is the region urbanizing at the fastest rate around the world. So this is a very enormous phenomenon, and I think it's worthy of our attention. Now, the physical expansion of cities, as we've seen over the past few decades, could be conceived or understood as a response to this increasing demand as people become urbanized, as people enter cities and begin to live in cities. And I think there's doubtless much truth to this kind of account. Right? It's a very standard Lewis model in which people leave the countryside to take on jobs in the cities and become urbanized in that fashion. And it's a very kind of natural process of decanting the countryside as people go into the city and assume urban identities and urban work. And it's a very kind of a natural flow of people that pushes the expansion of cities physically, driven by demographic transitions. Now, I think there's a lot of merit to that explanation. Obviously, we've seen an enormous inflow of people into cities. But in political economy, another sort of take on this is that actually what we might also be seeing is reflective of China's general capitalist transition to a form of capitalism in which is characterized by a mobilization of capital for industrialization, the creation of a labor force, so the drawing of people into the cities and the creation of a labor force, pro-growth regimes that take shape in cities throughout the administrative apparatus, and as a result also the production of cities as an outgrowth of industrial production and production of spaces of social reproduction, but also the making of cities as a focus for speculative investments. So that within sort of Marxian political economy is also, I think, a rather credible explanation. But I think the ghost town phenomenon actually seems somewhat paradoxical in light of these types of explanations. If demographic change and economic growth are proceeding at the rate that we see them in China, and we have plenty of evidence to show that indeed China is urbanizing rapidly and the economy is booming, how then do we account for this particular phenomenon of what has been called popularly ghost towns? Right? If there's such a huge number of people entering cities, how do we account for this excess of space is basically what the nature of the question. Now, I think it's worthwhile then to consider work by other scholars who are steeped in the reform era political economy of urban China, who note that the processes particular to China's historical experience and political system, as well as the Chinese state's persistent control over key sectors of the economy. And so recent work, past decade or so, has produced a number of theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks, to try to tease out this particular relationship. And so notions of state-led urbanization, for example, give us a sense that China's capitalist transition is also accompanied by the persistent role of the state in driving city growth. So state-led urbanization. Another is the notion of urbanization of the state, which Yo Tianxing has talked about, and I believe she was here a couple weeks ago expounding on that particular theme. Dry mouth. So this work overall, I think, has definitely provided us with a set of very useful analytical frames to analyze the kind of urbanism that we're seeing taking place in China. And my take here in this discussion, I draw upon this latter group of studies for analytical frames to use two key notions, really two key frameworks or two key concepts to consider this particular phenomenon of ghost cities. The first is land-centered urban entrepreneurialism, and the second being spectacular accumulation. And I use these as a way to frame the discussion and to tease out what I think are some of the key forces that are driving urban growth that achieve this sort of hyperbolic expression in the production of ghost cities. The discussion is actually quite eclectic conceptually, and but I've drawn these different ideas of land-centered urban entrepreneurialism and spectacular accumulation as a way to shed light on the different facets of these city-making enterprises. I think that there are more than just economic processes that drive this. There's a host of political and cultural processes as well. So my approach here also draws on some research, direct research conducted in Inner Mongolia, Hebei, Henan, Shanxi, and Jiangsu, as well as secondary sources and interviews and other work that's been produced recently on this topic. So then, ghost cities, right? I think it's a fair question to ask, what is this? Okay. So I have to begin first by noting that the idea of the ghost city is a media invention, right? It's something that was really invented in media discourses. And that term has caught on, and I think people have run with it. But I think it's also fair to say that the term itself would not have gained the currency that it now has did it not have some actual referent. Right? There's something to it. And indeed, there is an epidemic of oversupply, one might say. Right? And the supply is actually quite huge, right? The problem of oversupply. As of 2014, it's been estimated there are 50 million empty homes in China. That's a fifth of the housing stock, right? In urban China. And that's a national average vacancy rate, estimated. It's actually very difficult to make conclusive statements about vacancy rates in China, but it's, some work recently has found that probably about 22.4% of houses are empty. But in second and third tier cities, the rate is even higher, as you can see. Right? So media attention to this kind of issue, even though while we say this is kind of a media invention, it's actually been useful in generating a series of maps and a bunch of lists that have sought to document and map these places. And actually, most recently, some scholars at Peking University and working with people from the Baidu search engine in China have delivered a rather robust project, a study using data analytics to try to find out where these places are. So here, the study was called Ghost Cities Analysis based on positioning data in China, and they produced this map, although it's an incomplete one. They cut off their list at 50 ghost cities, so the number they came up with was 50, but it's a very round number, which should lead us to suspect that, why stop at 50? It could just be the limitations of their data. This is another map taken from the same study. So the way their methodology was to use geopositioning data and then link that with searches on the Baidu search engine, and to then determine whether particular places around China in urban places are not generating any searches using Baidu. And Baidu is the largest search engine in China by far, and so it's they use something like 770 million searches as their data set. So this is a substantial data set, and what these red dots represent is concentrations of searches in particular spaces for Baidu. And what you can note here is that there are this gray is built up areas where you don't find any searches. Right? This is Ordos, by the way, the one in Kambashi in Ordos. There's some work being done here, and it's using this type of data analytics to try to map and find these things. I would just say that their methodology, first of all, there's a huge digital divide in China, and so it's not necessarily the case that everyone is, first of all, using the internet or searching Baidu. So there's some imperfections in using that particular methodology, but I think it's good to see that people are actually producing very serious studies along this line. Also, the Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development is also very concerned in China with this particular problem of ghost cities, and they've come up with their own definition as a way to try to track these places down. And their definition is any place, urban place, with less than 5,000 people per square kilometer. So that's a very kind of rigid metric. Now I should just say that my approach, and I'm a qualitative guy, and I don't deal too much in large data sets and qualitative methods. So my approach to this issue, and it also contains an implicit critique of the Peking University study, is to note that these spaces that have come to our attention as ghost cities are actually about more than low tenancy and underutilization, right, of space. They are remarkable for their size, their speed, and the intensity of urban development that they index. Right? In other words, such spaces matter because low tenancy is actually symptomatic of other problems that are rooted in the very nature of China's urbanization, which is also to say that the dynamics that produce ghost cities are evident, even if less visibly so, everywhere across China. Right? So these are shared dynamics rooted in the political economy of urban growth. Emptiness or low tenancy on their own do not actually say much about how and why such projects come about and what might be done in response. And so that is the real thrust of my research. Right? So for me, what's useful about the lists that have been compiled so far is that it's actually possible, based on these studies and journalistic reports, to cobble together a series of rather long lists and to discern certain patterns in which sites are being identified as ghost towns. Now, the methodologies that I set about rigid definitions of which ones they are is less my concern. But what you can find actually quite clearly is that these particular places very consistently take on the form or are consistently applied to projects that are carried out under the formal framework of new districts, also known as Xinqu, and eco-cities within China. Oh, thank you. Do I sound raspy? I appreciate it, though. So, and these projects represent a form of radical urban development through the serial reproduction of planned urban mega projects. So it's likely that other projects, other kinds of large-scale projects, show similar problems as those we see in these. And some new districts like Pudong, which is also a Xinqu in Shanghai, has actually flourished. So it's not that all new districts or all eco-cities are ghost towns, but that the ghost towns that we can identify are almost always these kinds of projects, new districts, Xinqu, or eco-cities. There's also more recently, sometimes there are economic and technology development zones, ETDZs, known as 经济科技开发区, that are similar things to new districts, but new districts is much more common as a formal project. So, so I think it's important to note that the turn to planned urban mega projects is actually not without precedent in reform era China, but in fact follows a trend for development parks and zones that has roots in the 1980s and 1990s and produced what at the time Caroline Cartier called zone fever. Right? There's a proliferation, and some counts were as many as 7,000 zones of various types around China in the 1990s. Still, though, I think the most recent phase and evolution of these types of projects, of these zones, in the form of new districts, eco-cities, and a few others, that they are an evolution of this so-called zone fever from the 1990s, in that they have achieved a qualitatively different scale of action and a new form, as witnessed by attempts to create what are whole new cities, as opposed to industrial parks. So this is not attempts to create an industrial zone with factories, but these are actually attempts to create new cities. Right? And I think that's qualitatively different from what we saw in the 1980s and 90s. So these mega projects are currently a very powerful force reshaping physical spaces across urban China, and they serve as central platforms in many cities' development agendas. I say this because these projects are far from trivial in their physical size, in the amounts of capital that they mobilize, and the kinds of landscapes that they produce, as for example in producing landscapes that have been read, for better or worse, as ghost towns. So just to give a sense of these, just a select few examples, you can see right away these new districts are not small in size. Right? These are also much larger than the industrial zones that were made in the 1990s that were sometimes 5 kilometers squared, 10 kilometers squared. Now we're achieving a qualitatively different scale of action here in these new projects. This number, the number in brackets is the planned built area, and the other number is the planned area. It often includes a lot of rural area or parks and other sort of set-aside areas. So, but still, 50 square kilometers is a lot of city, right? So quite obviously, this trend also reflects a decisive rejection of incremental city growth in favor of massive scale, peri-urban, project-led growth. And their scale, speed, and radicalism help to explain why these projects have attracted so much attention from investors as well as the popular press. Now, cities of differing ranks across China have embarked on construction of new towns, new districts, eco-cities, what I collectively call urban megaprojects. They've become, or at least they were for a time, there's some signs now that these are on the wane, preferred ways of creating new spaces for profit. They are fundamentally property development schemes of gigantic scale that proclaim to resolve different problems, such as enhancing the functionality of cities by shifting functions from dense urban centers to peri-urban areas, or in the case of eco-cities, by trying to establish new precedents for low-carbon living. Now, while these claimed motivations aren't entirely absent in practice, these urban megaprojects are first and foremost commercial land ventures organized and controlled by local states, by which I mean mostly municipalities, but sometimes also sub-municipality districts. Yeah. And these are advanced, as I say here, through land-centered urban entrepreneurialism and private speculative investment in the built environment. So I say mega projects. Now, by mega project, quite simply, the term may be self-explanatory, but I'll say something about it quickly. I use this term following Gellert and Lynch, who use this term to reference what they say projects which transform landscapes rapidly, intentionally, and profoundly in very visible ways, and require coordinated applications of corporate and state power. There are multiple definitions of mega projects out there, but what matters for me in using this term is a combination of size, cost, speed, and the deliberately disruptive transformations that they intend to bring about. Right? So for anyone who's been to China in recent years, you probably agree with me that there are mega projects going on all over the place that fit this general description. And taking the numbers of projects and their typical size, such as these new districts and eco-cities, it is very clear that a significant share of China's recent urban build-out has actually taken the form of these urban mega projects built in these peri-urban areas. It's hard to put a precise number on these because, as we noted, the definitions vary and the data is also very scarce. But from what we can put together, we can make this general claim. The second thing that matters in this phenomenon is that mega projects are always enterprises in making new spaces, and I think this matters. These urban mega projects in China are incontestably processes of urban space production. So also significant is that the urban mega projects, they constitute a particular kind of space because they are in peri-urban areas. And I think we can perhaps think of these as sort of urban frontiers, right? Now, of course, frontiers, this is a very popular metaphor, but I think it can also have some analytical purchase because frontiers are produced. They don't exist somewhere out there. Frontiers are actively produced by movements of interloping forces into new territory. But frontiers are also about generating discourses of excitement and enthrallment in the production of new spaces. In Anna Ching's words, frontiers are projects in making geographical and temporal experiences. Right? The fact that these projects that we're looking at that are these ghost town projects foreground quite explicitly the idea of newness suggests that the emphasis on making new spaces in these kinds of places is also about selling and producing the new as part of the experience of the urban in today's China. So China's new cities and new districts and eco-city projects are universally located in peri-urban sites. and they're massive in size. They mobilize huge amounts of public and private investment, and they are drawn up at incredibly rapid speed so that they are proposed one year and they begin construction that same year and are often, the skeletons of which are often finished within a year or two, 3 at a stretch. They also generate, however, and are sustained by elaborate visions and image-making efforts. A lot of placemaking goes into these things. And they also, and as such, they embody China's land-centered urban entrepreneurialism on the one hand, and private pecuniary accumulation on the other. So in the following sections, what I want to do is I want to sketch out what I mean by this in more detail. And in the course of this, I think this ghost town phenomenon should come into sharper focus. So I break up the discussion into 2 parts. The first is about land-centered urban entrepreneurialism, and the second about spectacular accumulation. Now, I've acquired a bit of a habit from a former mentor, Dick Walker, who likes to use alliterative subheadings for his, to structure his talks. So I have followed in his path. So I have mandarins, modules, monuments, money, and mansions, which are thematic. So one of the key characteristic features of China's land-centered urban entrepreneurialism is the persistence of a strong state role in the property market, something which I'm sure is well familiar to many of you here, and then to even people who tangentially are interested in China's urbanization. Now, this situation is tied to the state's continued persistent tenure of de jure ownership of urban land as established in the PRC Constitution, and the creation of use rights for urban land and the creation of a market for use rights for leases in urban land since 1988. In this context, municipal entities are technically the regulator, but they're also the dominant participant in primary land markets. In practice, however, and I think Yo Tianxing has brought this out in her studies, there's considerable contention over who precisely represents the state owner in the cities. And this underscores the internally conflicted and competitive nature of urban developments in China these days. Local actors, including municipal governments, sub-municipal governments, agencies within city governments, as well as large state-owned enterprises that have plots of land in cities, all have credible claims to land in cities. Right? And so there is fierce struggle, as we've seen in recent years, over between these competing entities, over claims to seize and maintain and develop land, since land has become such a valuable resource in urban China. So as part of this process of land development, you find powerful growth coalitions have emerged, combining local government leaders and institutions, as well as in combination with developers, all of whom have very strong mutual interests in expanding the city physically for the purposes of economic advantage and territorializing state power by controlling and building things in place. Right? So ownership is 90% of possession, or possession is 90% of ownership. And in this case, building on things is a way to stamp your ownership of places for different groups within urban China. So for the municipal government, there are 2 overriding interests in pushing land development. First, because municipal entities' fiscal positions were seriously undermined following tax reforms in 1994 that forced cities to share greater amounts of their revenue with the central government, cities have turned to land as a kind of bank or ATM from which to derive fiscal resources. The fact that revenue derived from land sales, leases, conveyance fees, rents, etc., are categorized formally under the term extra budgetary revenue, they are not conceived as tax income and therefore do not need to be shared with the central state. And so there's a very strong interest there in using land development as a way to boost the fiscal positions of cities. The second overriding interest for local officials is the importance of GDP to growth in top city officials' performance assessments and the production of concrete achievements, 具体成就, which sounds like a pun in English, but is actually much less punny in Chinese. Now, failure to meet target growth rates can derail officials' advancement along their career path. And whereas actually meeting target growth rates and producing a set of concrete achievements can smooth the process up the administrative chain. And the process is almost always upward up the administrative rank in the city system. Now, to meet these two general objectives, construction has proved a vital way to repeatedly deliver shots in the arm to the local economy under the guise of infrastructure provision and to create objects that demonstrate strong state capacity. And so it is common, for example, in China, I'm sure many of you have seen this, to see roads that get continually dug up every year as a way to kind of goose growth locally. Or when a new administration comes in, they'll tear down an office building and build a new one as a way to use construction very simply to boost GDP growth. Right? And this is something that people in China talk about all the time. One example from the city of Datong, where I've done some research, which was actually recently just in the New York Times, had a big piece on it. The mayor came in 2008. The second day on the job, he showed up at the planning bureau, asked to see the master plan that existed at the time, basically tore it up and said, I'm going to come back in a few months with my own master plan. And sure enough, he did, and it was a huge one. And you find this continuing in city after city, that with each new administration, there's a drive to come in and sort of stamp your own identity on city spaces. So, and part of this also has to do with the insecure tenures. So urban officials, at most, are in place for 5 years, usually for 2 or 3. Recent studies have shown that 3-year tenures tends to be on the long side for urban officials. So they have a very short window within which to demonstrate capacity in order to move up the chain. So producing big things is one way to do so. So these elements of Chinese urban political economy are quite general and I think probably very familiar to you. But they are essential to appreciate the political origins of the constraints and opportunities in urban land development. In particular, the short terms that local leaders serve incentivize debt-financed grand projects, especially if the financial problems that result fall to your successors. Since if you leave, the debts that accrue, you don't end up paying. So the successor regimes are holding the bag. Now, with that in mind, these urban mega projects like new districts and eco-cities are always useful to achieve these fiscal and political objectives. And given the number of such projects, it's clear that many urban administrations have turned to this method to boost GDP growth. Now, what is specific, however, about urban mega projects is that they dispense with the nettlesome and small bore style of incremental growth in cities. And they instead allow city governments to acquire vast tracts of land in one fell swoop, setting in motion large-scale development from the get-go. Right? And so when I say modules here, I'm actually being somewhat literal. If we consider these urban mega projects, new districts and eco-cities, more closely at the level of planning and design, we find that they follow a very, very familiar template and a pattern from city to city. Lisa Hoffman, in a great chapter on urban modeling in the book Worlding Cities, has called the tendency of Chinese cities to turn to models as a form of interreferencing among cities in China and across Asia. One might also call it, perhaps less charitably, as a form of urban mimicry, as urban administrations, one after the other, mimic the development programs of peer cities, and especially those of the so-called dragon head cities of Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. So as a planning official involved in the production of Kangbashi and Ordos explained to me, the political logic of modular forms of urban development is actually quite simple and straightforward. Proven templates are more quickly approved by higher levels of the governmental apparatus, which are still, in these cases, still have to sign off on these large-scale projects. And so if a project has been approved in a peer city, then it's very difficult for the provincial level administrations to refuse a city of similar rank to also undertake such a project. And it becomes internally very conflictual. And so these things tend to be rolled out as part of that process. And so as a result, we find in case after case, these urban mega projects invariably feature a consistent complement of features. Right? They're basically kind of just repeat each other, including new government offices, gigantic squares, and a checklist of architectural landmarks that I think are very familiar to those of us who study China. They always have a museum, there's always a stadium, there's always a cultural center of some sort, and an elaborate new library, often designed by very high-profile and expensive architects. So the repetition of these schemes is actually not lost on people in China. In China, actually, the isomorphism of these urban mega projects is the subject of widespread ridicule and derision because of the self-evident waste, or at least perceived waste, and the kinds of grandstanding that they seem to represent. In China, the term 前程一面, a thousand cities, one face, is a way of describing the reproduction of these cities as just sort of, they all look the same, right? And as a result of this, the modular form of urban development projects. So, but what is the value of seizing large land tracts in peri-urban areas for modular urban mega projects to expand the city? Once again, for the local state, there are political and economic dimensions to this question. On the economic side, urban mega projects exemplify the land finance model just alluded to, whereby land under city government control is used to bankroll the ever-increasing set of expenses that cities face. They have growing lists of mandated expenses, and they actually have fairly limited resources and tax revenues. But unlike in inner city redevelopment, where land is already very expensive and dense populations make demolition irksome and sometimes even violent, negotiating land deals with village collectives adjacent to municipalities is generally simpler and always much cheaper. And in particular, the administrative conversion of cheaply acquired rural land on the edge of cities into the valuable category of urban construction land, formerly incorporated into the urban system, exposes enormous rent gaps that are ripe for exploitation. Right? The potential profits to be derived from these rent gaps are massive and are richly exploited, as we know from many accounts. In the Kambashi case, for example, the planned area for Kambashi was acquired for a cost of about 20 million yuan by displacing roughly 3 villages and about 124 households. Later, those plots of land, or the land was divided up into development plots and sold off to developers for sometimes as much as 100 times the original cost per unit of land. So those kinds of rent gaps are a very powerful motivator, as you can imagine. Now, not surprisingly, too, when the villagers who were displaced caught wind of this, they mobilized a rather, in some cases, violent movement for redress, but that proved ultimately fruitless. Now, the political element of these modular urban mega projects that we see in recent years is also important for the avenues that they open up to allow cities to manipulate territorial scale to their advantage within the spatial administrative hierarchy in China. For example, the annexation and reclassification of rural counties as county-level districts under a municipality produces a much more powerful entity than a new administrative entity that is still under the municipal umbrella. Right? So we see this throughout China in recent decades, that cities are expanding by annexing adjacent counties and turning them into county-level districts under a city. And there's various iterations of this, but the expansion is to incorporate them both administratively and physically. Now, these new districts and eco-cities, these peri-urban mega projects, are the latest round of this kind of maneuvering, as they establish territorial entities that are directly beneath the municipality. However, a crucial difference is that unlike the creation of new county-level districts, as was done in the past, which obtain formal status and have a standard bureaucratic apparatus and presence in the government, these urban mega projects are administered through project-specific commissions appointed by the municipalities. They're typically known as 委员会 or some kind of bureau, but these usually in conjunction with a municipality-owned development corporation, which is used as a platform to draw loans and investment for these projects. So the Zhengdong, which is shown here, the Zhengdong New District is run not as a county-level district, despite its name. It's actually run as a project under a bureau, which basically makes it a corporate entity, right, controlled by the municipality of Zhengzhou. So through these various means, municipalities create vast new territory, governed through tightly held corporate entities. In other words, municipal governments create gigantic new cities, but that administratively are firmly under their jurisdiction and do not feature the formal apparatus of a county-level district within a formal bureaucracy. So they have this very peculiar identity within the bureaucratic system. Now, in the absence of political and fiscal and civil society constraints that might temper cities' ambitions, these urban megaprojects are also notable for their monumental character. And I think it's worth pointing this out at some length. Developments are carried out with an aesthetic of supreme size and self-evident extravagance. The recent controversy over Xi Jinping's ban on so-called weird architecture contains multiple examples of things coming from precisely these urban megaprojects. In some cases, high-profile foreign architects and planners are drawn in to design these things, such as Kisho Kurokawa, who was invited to design the Zhengdong New District. Arup, a very high-profile engineering and design firm, has produced the Tianjin Eco-City. Ma Yansong is a protege of Zaha Hadid, and he designed and built this museum in Ordos. There's these monumental project-led strategies reflect what I would say is a turn toward urban spectacle as a key component of this land-centered urban entrepreneurialism. Architectural statements anchor these projects, and they are driven by coordinated image-making processes designed to stimulate interest and inward investment. Now, urban administrations across China have learned very quickly the game of using elaborate designs such as these to establish a unique identity for their projects. And indeed, many city mayors are very fluent in the language of urban branding. And in fact, they use that particular term in selling their cities. So as these cities featuring these kinds of urban mega projects reveal, spectacular urbanism is alive and well, even in second-tier and third-tier cities. So it's not just something for Beijing and Shanghai. You travel to even the small cities in the interior of China, and you'll come across these elaborate architectural landmarks that seem somewhat confounding, and yet they do emerge out of this particular logic. So, but while land-centered urban entrepreneurialism is generative of these kinds of urban mega projects, I think it would be a mistake to overlook the important role played by private speculative investment as the other side of the coin in these kinds of developments. Referring back to the conceptualization of frontiers as projects in making geographical and temporal experiences, the spectacular elements of urban mega projects are what I would say performances that try to convince people of the new urban futures available in these kinds of sites, or what Iowa Ong calls promissory notes on particular futures. So again, following Anna Ching, investment in these kinds of frontier settings, urban frontier settings, is highly speculative and relies on optimism buttressed by a theatrics of economic growth. Widespread participation in the speculative development of urban mega projects turns the accumulation process for regular home buyers into an extension of the land-centered urban entrepreneurial model. So the strategy to build massive urban mega projects through these kinds of highly spectacular modules is driven not simply by the local state alone, but it also has a strong component on the other end of households and enterprises, firms investing in these types of places as well. So property, as we all know, has been a very hot market in China in the 2000s, and everyday people show a strong willingness to buy into projects and take part in the accumulation through property investment. The focus on using investments in the built environment as one part of the twin engine of economic growth in China, the other being industrialization, has led to what we all know is a staggering flow of capital into real estate. Now, with the properties market serving a key role as a site of investment, as well as obviously a site with a definite use value in terms of homes and offices, there's a remarkable enthusiasm for this process of growth. Indeed, China's home ownership rate is over 80%. Private home ownership rate is over 80%, higher than the US rate at its former peak, its most recent peak in 2007. So for urban residents, it's also a fact and rather common that for nuclear households in cities of a certain income level to have 2 or more homes, as purchases are frequently made through generous subsidy schemes provided through their workplaces or through home ownership provident funds that people buy into over time at their work, that these things greatly incentivize. There's multiple incentives for purchases in homes. But what is particularly prominent in these urban mega projects is the role of property as a financial asset, as evidenced by the low occupation of these buildings. So despite the commercial failure implied by the term ghost town, the urban mega projects hold very few unsold properties, as has been widely reported. In Kangbashi, for example, the new developments were sold almost 100%. In Zhengdong, also, about 100%. The similar story is told in Caofeidian and around Tianjin. The Tianjin Eco-City is a little bit less so, but in any case, virtually all of the urban mega projects of this sort that I looked into, all of them have over 90% ownership, if not tenancy, in these particular properties. So the financial asset nature of property is underscored by the apparent indifference of owners to actually inhabit the homes or to use the offices. Right? So for this reason, the few rigorous studies of this phenomenon that have taken place so far, they're, without good information on tenancy, they're kind of left, how do we assess this? And what some have done is to conduct nighttime visits to these spots to count the number of lights you see on buildings, and in that sense, to try to devise some sense of how many people are actually living there and using the spaces. And what they find, actually, is what we know, is that these urban mega projects are indeed very sparsely inhabited. Kangbashi, for example, as of last summer, had about 50,000 inhabitants, despite having enough space for an estimated 1 million people. Now, property in the form of homes or offices has, as we can tell, become a key financial tool driving demand as households and investors park their savings in property for the long term. There are no retirement savings accounts or Social Security in China. These types of investments are deemed to be quite safe. Moreover, to safeguard the investment, there's little tolerance for the wear and tear caused by renters. Sorry, most of us are renters probably. So much of this property stock purchased as a financial asset is not actually utilized, and despite there being plenty of vacancies. So rents are actually incredibly high because so few empty places are put on the market. So it's, even if these urban mega projects experience short-term struggles and high rates of tenancy, or low rates of tenancy, faith in future growth actually remains very strong. And as informants in city after city and project after project that I visited told me, homes can always be used as a home in case your family grows or something, or you get divorced and you want to separate and live somewhere else. And so they seem to always find some kind of utility, always in the back of their minds. This provides a kind of backstop to these sorts of investments. So it's too early, I think, to assess the optimism, this kind of optimism towards the long-term use of these projects or these properties. And in any case, these projects in the current day do trigger rather immediate problems. And since John Maynard Keynes reminded us the long term has a certain feature to it in which we're all dead. Right? So it's important to think of the here and now. So connected to that then, connected to the financialization of property, this source of demand has placed extreme pressure on developers to prioritize high-end development in order to squeeze maximum profit out of the given tracts of land that they're able to acquire. Moreover, the financial manias triggered by speculative activity in these sites have made prices skyrocket to some of the highest levels in China, despite them being virtually empty. Right? As my research in Kangbashi revealed as well, the use of property as a financial asset and the opening of the new district as a new municipal project and a frontier for urban growth actually helped to propel massive networks of informal finance as buyers and developers attempted to acquire loans quickly, going around banks that maybe would be more scrutinizing of their projects to move projects forward quickly. And buyers would also acquire loans through high interest lending to purchase on the other end. Right? According to the Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development, some 200 billion yuan were said to be circulating in these networks of informal finance just in Ordos alone. And that an estimated 80% of developments were all taking part and using that form of finance, many of which actually turned out to be little more than Ponzi schemes. So these urban mega projects in this way have become veritable hotspots for casino-like development of massive, high-end property used as financial instruments. The inflationary pressures on property caused by this convergence of factors set the stage for highly volatile growth, growth of the kind that drives exponential rises in prices and land values, but that also sets the stage for crisis when demand is proven to fall short. This high-risk investment environment is also a breeding ground for scams. So, for example, the Ordos 100 project is a very well-known project in Ordos in Kambashi. The developer hired Ai Weiwei, the very famous artist, to curate the process and had a lot of foreign architects come in and generated a lot of press about it. And through that, made a bunch of pre-sales to use the pre-sales to build up the rest of the ones, the rest of the project. It built a few sort of first 4 or 5 houses to kind of show intention. And then having used these as basically sales points, drew pre-sales worth about 200 million yuan and then absconded. So no one's seen the developer since 2012. So this kind of story repeats itself throughout these projects. So some believe he's in Germany. Yeah. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that I would return to this ghost town notion. And I hope to impress that this implies that the term ghost town in China refers not to spaces that have been abandoned, but places that are awaiting habitation. Construction of floor space and urban megaprojects has tended to outpace quite massively the in-migration for sustained periods of time, leading such projects to acquire the appearance of towns thrown up with great haste and enthusiasm, but lacking a critical mass of people to give such spaces a sense of vibrant urbanism. Right? Crucially, unlike ghost towns of the American West, or maybe Las Vegas, the abandoned condo complexes of Vegas or Jacksonville or something, or Stockton, China's ghost towns are not defined exclusively by emptiness, right, precipitated by acute crisis. Rather, they're cities in waiting. Right? And for this reason, I think it's important to caution that what today we call ghost town might seem premature in a few years' time, as with Zhengdong, which actually just last year registered some pretty respectable population growth in the project itself. But nonetheless, these projects are cities premised upon the dispossession of rural dwellers and exclusion of lower income residents in the course of property-driven economic growth. And they have also become middle income and higher income enclaves for those who choose to live in them. They're actually not such bad places to live. When I was in Ordos, I spent a fair amount of time in Kambashi. Yeah, it's very clean, it's very nice, it's capacious, and you can go out and running and stuff, which you can't do in most of cities in China. So, not that bad. So while the ontological status of the ghost town is rather hard to pin down and rather difficult to set down in stone, I've tried to make the case that such sites are characterized by the hyperbolic manifestation of political economic logics driving land development in today's urban China toward the profit-oriented production of space and towards supreme size regardless of population's use values for the space. Thus, as one scholar has noted, these cities in China are what he calls walls without markets, 有事无城, right? So walls without people, basically. And so is this likely to change? What does the future hold for these places? And to quote Lenin, what is to be done? Widely reported financial troubles faced by many urban mega projects in the recent context of slower economic growth suggest that these projects' time may have come and gone. New districts and eco-cities are now no longer being approved unless they undergo a very rigorous process to demonstrate need. However, in their place, we're actually finding that new projects, quite redolent of the forebears, like airport cities and university towns are coming about. And university towns have actually been around for some time, but they're still growing, raising the prospect of yet another evolution of this trend. This means that the future will actually determine whether these projects are white elephants or turn out to be like great cities, as with Washington, D.C. Of course, it took Washington, D.C. roughly 150 years. So, and if the spigot is back on for a flow of fresh credit, which seems to be the case recently, roughly $1 trillion of credit has been flowing into the economy under Xi Jinping in the past year or so, then the day of possible reckoning for these types of projects is potentially still very far off. And in the meantime, the bonanza for land projects continues. Thank you. Sorry,
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. We have a very tight time because we have been blamed for being slow in clearing the space for classes. So we have about 5 minutes for question and answer.
My apologies for taking so long. I don't want to cut into the Q&A.
Yeah, my question
Yes.
is, in your research, are there any examples that after a new district was finished, they were successful, not become gold cities? If there are such examples, do you study what are the major factors that make some new districts successful, others become gold cities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see. Well, to take one example, right, the Pudong district in Shanghai. Pudong is a new district, right, and it was the first new district. Right? It set the template, right, as a kind of CBD financial hub place. It cannot be said to have failed, right? Pudong is occupied, it's used, it's obviously sold as well. So it's not that the specific category of new districts fail across the board, right? It's not that new districts fail. It's that the failure of certain places or the production of these kinds of landscapes is also overlaps with the broad category of new districts. So to your question of what is it precisely that causes these things, in lower tier cities, what we're finding is that the in-migration into lower tier cities is not as fast as it is to larger cities. That's part of the issue. But I think it's difficult to say. I think what precisely sets the particular causes. In fact, in going through this, in looking into this, part of what became difficult is that a focus on what produces ghost towns actually ends up being diverting the focus from the general processes that are actually applied to other sites as well. That the ghost towns end up being what are hyperbolic manifestations in certain sites that happen to be contained in these types of projects. So it's not fully answering your question, but it's kind of the best I can do given where we sort of stand on these things.
So I'd like to kind of question your argument about the hyperbolic nature of these new cities and new developments a little bit. I mean, I think you emphasize this characteristic, but I wonder if this is just characteristic of China in general. I mean, like these large buildings are not just in these new developments, but they're everywhere. Everywhere you see new construction in China.
So, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Everywhere you go, downtown areas, you'll find, say in Shanghai, for example, the redevelopment of Renmin Square in downtown Shanghai also included a very fancy museum and other things. And so it is absolutely true that spectacular development is not exclusive to these kinds of projects. But what actually separates these in formal terms from them is two things. First of all, qualitatively, they tried to produce cities sort of de novo, right, at a shot, right, to include multifunctional sites that are multifunctional urban spaces, as opposed to sort of interventions, smaller scale interventions with a limited number of functions, as with introducing a large, pretty building in a certain downtown area, or maybe even a larger redevelopment, but that includes sort of a CBD, but it's actually just a single function. It's a business function downtown. You find that in Beijing, for example, on Financial Street in Beijing. Right? So what I think is interesting about these is that these are large-scale projects, right? Obviously very large, so much larger than your usual intervention in the downtown areas. There's more acupunctural sort of interventions in the downtown areas. And they aim to achieve full multifunctional city status from the planning stage at the very beginning, and to do so in a very compressed time frame. So usually the idea is to populate these things, since many of them were initiated around early 2000s, the time horizon for full population of these things was 2020. So that's still 5 years out, but the current rate suggests that most won't be close to fully populating them, for the reasons just identified, that many of the spaces are not intended for habitation. They're intended for speculative investments. So does that kind of, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess related to that is how do you I think the question is more like, how do you separate a ghost city from a city under development, which is something that we've been struggling with, right? Because you see these big, massive developments, and some of them very successful, right? Like not ghost cities, right? And so how do you separate the two? Is I think the question that she's asking. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I think that's also the part of the first question, right? So I think I started in the beginning, right, by saying sort of what are these ghost cities, and part of what I want to do is kind of moving beyond that question, or sort of setting it aside a little bit, right? Because if the focus is on what are these things and where are they, then I think the study or the understanding of them becomes actually constrained by a limited focus on something that actually has a very unclear ontological status. Right, so you can tease apart this actual idea of the ghost town in all kinds of directions, and I don't know where it leaves you, right? So, but actually what you can instead do is examine these kinds of projects as new districts. And so if you're thinking, and I think you're probably thinking in sort of methodological terms, where do we begin, right? So my choice was not to try to think, where do we find low tenancy, low population, low in-migration, and then go from there, but actually to look at the formal project type. In other words, new districts, eco-cities. And you could bring in maybe a couple others, right? But I've chosen to limit it to those two, and then to look at those, right? And what you find in many of those, and it's just not universal to this type of formal project that they become ghost towns, but that these become lenses through which to see how the process of production of these spaces bring out these kinds of landscapes in certain contexts through these particular logics of space production.
I can't agree with Max, because if you identify the locations of ghost city, so what? Right? There's no solution to it at the moment. So I would rather the government and the scholar focus the attention on finding the underlying reason for the emergence of that phenomenon. To me, I think it's a mismatch of resource allocation due to personal investment in real estate market. Because apparently in China, there are people who own 3 or 4 houses simultaneously, and there are people who don't have ownership of houses. So there's a mismatch of allocation of resources, of building all these high upscale properties throughout China that the poor people cannot buy. So in other words, their empty unit, they are priced so highly that the people who are poor, who need housing, cannot buy or rent. That is the problem. That's the gap that we need to think about how to solve.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
But as the speaker point out, if it's 100% or close to 100% sold, in that case, success, well, it's sold already. So
Success.
For the builder,
Depending on where you stand.
right. But they're empty, not used, so it's underutilized.
No, but again, remember, property depreciate.
Right.
If you leave the property stand alone without anybody living there for several years, the value drop tremendously. You buy a house for the amenity. You buy the neighborhood. You buy into the neighborhood. You don't buy 4 walls. That is a problem.
But in China, we don't know, because they put the
Okay,
money, they have no money to invest elsewhere, so they put in the real estate.
Yes.
Potentially in the future, there's value.
Okay, I'm sorry. Helen is getting nervous, and we have to. Maybe we can actually find a room next door.
9427 is
Yeah, and then continue the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a big issue. It's a big issue. Yeah.
I'd be happy to talk more in this next room, yeah.
The next room.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.